My name is Mara Whitfield. I am 35 years old, and I own a small grooming salon on the corner of Maple and Ninth, the kind of place where regular customers know each other's dogs by name before they know each other's last names. 6 years of my life are folded into that storefront. 6 years of my marriage are folded into a man named Ryan, and 6 years of quiet, polite hostility are folded into his mother, Patricia, who never once looked at me the way a mother looks at someone she wants for her son. I found out how deep that hostility went on a Thursday evening in October, standing outside my own salon after closing, watching through the glass as my husband held my best friend's face in both his hands. Jenna Reyes and I had been inseparable since the 4th grade. She was the one who taught me how to French braid, the one who sat with me in the hospital waiting room when my father had his first heart attack, the one who cried harder than I did at my own wedding. When I told her I wanted to open a grooming salon, she was the one who believed me before I believed myself. She wasn't a business partner, not officially, but she worked the front desk 3 days a week and handled my social media. And I paid her fairly and trusted her completely. That trust sat curdled in my stomach as I watched Ryan's thumb brush across her cheek. Gentle, familiar, like he had done it 100 times before. Jenna didn't pull away. She leaned into it. I didn't storm inside. I didn't scream. I stood on the sidewalk with my car keys cutting into my palm, and I made myself watch the whole thing, because some part of me already understood that this moment was going to require a clear head, not a shattered one. I drove home that night without turning on the radio. Ryan came in 2 hours later, smelling like the coffee shop 2 blocks from the salon. Told me he'd stayed late finishing a proposal for his firm, kissed my forehead like nothing in the world had shifted. I let him believe I hadn't seen anything. I needed time to understand what I was actually looking at before I said a single word. Because the thing about Patricia, my mother-in-law, is that she had never hidden her opinion of me. Not cruelly, not loudly, always wrapped in something that sounded almost like concern. At our engagement dinner, she told Ryan, in front of the whole table, that she just hoped he knew what he was signing up for with a woman who spent her weekends elbow-deep in dog hair instead of building a real career. At our wedding shower, she'd given a toast about how marriage required a partner who understood the family's standards, and she hadn't looked at me once while she said it. For 6 years, I told myself it was old-fashioned protectiveness, a mother who loved her son too much to let go gracefully. I told myself a lot of things. What I hadn't told myself, because I hadn't known it, was that Patricia had spent those same 6 years quietly building a bridge between her son and my best friend, plank by plank, so slowly that neither Ryan nor Jenna ever noticed they were walking across it. Ryan and I met at a mutual friend's housewarming party when I was 28, still working double shifts at a corporate grooming chain, saving every spare dollar toward a business plan I kept folded in the bottom drawer of my nightstand. He was easy to love in those early years, patient with my long hours, curious about the industry I was trying to break into, the first person outside my own family who actually read my business plan, cover to cover instead of nodding politely and changing the subject. I brought him home to meet my parents within 4 months. It took almost a year before Patricia invited me to her house for anything beyond a holiday obligation, and even then, the invitation came through Ryan, never directly from her. I remember the first dinner at her house clearly, because it was the first time I understood that Patricia measured people the way some people measure fabric, checking for flaws before deciding whether something was worth keeping. She asked about my education, my 5-year plan, whether I intended to keep working once children entered the picture, and every answer I gave seemed to land somewhere just short of the mark she was hoping for. Ryan noticed none of it. He told me afterward that his mother just took time to warm up to people, and I believed him because believing him was easier than accepting that I had already been quietly filed under disappointing. Jenna came into that world differently. Patricia met her at our engagement party, where Jenna gave a toast so warm and so funny that half the room was in tears by the end of it. And I watched something shift in Patricia's expression that night, an interest sharpening into something more deliberate. Within a month, Patricia had invited Jenna to her book club, Within 3 months, Jenna had a standing invitation to Sunday dinners that predated any invitation extended to me during our entire courtship. I told myself it was flattering, that my mother-in-law and my best friend simply got along, that this was one less relationship I needed to manage in a family already full of quiet tension. I didn't yet understand that Patricia rarely did anything without a reason attached. I started noticing the pattern only after that night outside the salon, when I began looking backward instead of forward. Every family barbecue where Jenna had somehow been invited before I even mentioned her name to Patricia. Every holiday dinner where Patricia sat Jenna directly across from Ryan, just to balance the table. Every time Patricia complimented Jenna's cooking, her ambition, her laugh, always in front of Ryan, always followed by some small remark about how lucky whoever ended up with a woman like that would be. I had heard those comments for years and filed them away as harmless. Mothers say strange things. I never once considered that they were instructions. The morning after I saw them through the glass, I went to the salon early, before Jenna's shift, and I sat in my own office looking at 6 years of bank statements like I was seeing them for the first time. I found what I expected to find, and something I didn't. Small transfers, a few $100s here and there over the past year, moved from the salon's operating account into a savings account I didn't recognize, authorized under Jenna's login credentials, which she had because she handled scheduling software and I had never thought to restrict it. Not enough to bankrupt the business, enough to be deliberate, enough to be building toward something. I didn't confront her that day. I smiled at her when she walked in, asked about her weekend, watched her laugh at something a client said, and felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. I had spent my whole life being the person who kept the peace, who assumed good intentions, who gave everyone the benefit of every doubt because that was easier than the alternative. That morning, I understood I was done being that person, but I also understood that doing this badly would cost me more than doing it right. I called my cousin Danielle, a paralegal at a firm downtown, and asked her casually what it would take to trace unauthorized transfers out of a business account. She didn't ask why. She just told me, and I started writing everything down. That was when Ethan Cole walked back into the story, although at the time I didn't know his name yet or what he'd meant to Jenna 2 years earlier. I met him by accident, at a hardware store of all places, buying a new lock for the salon's back office. He recognized my face from the salon's Instagram page, said his dog got groomed there once when Jenna still ran the account, and mentioned her name with a strange flatness that made me look at him twice. I asked how he knew her. He said they dated for almost 2 years, that it had ended suddenly, that he'd never fully understood why until a mutual friend told him something he still couldn't quite believe. He told me that near the end of his relationship with Jenna, she'd started pulling away right after a dinner with Ryan's family, one she'd been invited to as a friend of Mara's at Patricia's insistence. Ethan said Jenna came home from that dinner, different, quiet, distracted, and within 3 weeks she'd ended things with him, telling him only that she needed to figure out what she actually wanted from her life. He'd assumed it was about him. He said Patricia had called Jenna twice in the weeks before the breakup, and Jenna had taken both calls in another room. I stood in the middle of the hardware store aisle with a lock in my hand and felt the whole shape of it settle into place. Patricia hadn't just tolerated Jenna's presence in our lives. She had cultivated it, nurtured it, cleared a path for it, even if it meant quietly helping to end another woman's relationship along the way. Ethan and I exchanged numbers that day, both of us circling the same question from different directions. He wanted to understand what had actually happened to him. I wanted proof of what was happening to me. Neither of us wanted revenge for its own sake. Not at first. We wanted the truth laid out where we could both finally see it clearly. We met again 2 days later at a coffee shop far enough from my neighborhood that I didn't worry about being seen. Ethan brought his phone and scrolled back through months of old messages, stopping on the ones that had never made sense to him until now. He showed me a photo Jenna had sent him from a family barbecue at Patricia's house. The two of them not even dating anymore by then, but she'd forwarded it anyway with the caption, "Patricia says I should come to more of these. She says I fit better than I think. Ethan said he'd read that message a dozen times over the past 2 years, trying to decide whether it meant something or nothing. Sitting across from me, watching my face as I read it, he finally understood which one it was. He also remembered something else, a detail he hadn't thought mattered until now. A few weeks before their breakup, Patricia had taken Jenna aside at that same barbecue and told her quietly that Ryan had once mentioned he felt like something was missing in his marriage, that he'd never really felt chosen the way he wanted to feel chosen. Ethan said Jenna came home from that conversation unusually quiet, and 2 weeks later she ended things with him without much explanation. I sat very still when he told me that, because I recognized the tactic immediately. Patricia hadn't needed to lie outright. She only needed to plant a single seed of doubt in exactly the right person and let it grow on its own, watered by nothing more than suggestion and repetition. I started keeping a written log after that conversation, dates, times, small details I might have dismissed before. The Sunday Patricia sat Ryan and Jenna together at a trivia night while I was stuck in the kitchen helping Walter carry out appetizers. The Christmas Patricia gave Jenna a bracelet nearly identical to one she'd given me the year before, then told me privately that she'd found it while thinking of someone in the family who deserved something special this year. At the time, I'd assumed she meant me. Reading it back months later, I understood she almost certainly hadn't. Over the following 3 weeks, I lived 2 lives. In one, I was the wife who kissed her husband goodbye every morning and asked about his day every evening, giving nothing away. In the other, I was building a case with the same patience I used to teach a nervous dog to sit still for a nail trim, slow, steady, one small success at a time. I asked Danielle to help me formally document the transfers, which by then had grown to just under $9,000 over 14 months. Always timed to land right after slower sales weeks, when I was less likely to notice a dip. I pulled the salon's original partnership paperwork, the one that made clear Jenna had never held equity, only employment, no matter how many people at family functions referred to her as my business partner. I quietly changed the login credentials on every account she had access to, framing it to her as a routine security update after a data breach at our software provider, which was, conveniently, actually true that month. Ethan, for his part, had kept text messages from the final weeks of his relationship with Jenna, including one where she'd written, half apologetic, half resigned, that she felt like she was being pulled somewhere she couldn't explain, that Patricia kept telling her she deserved a family that truly valued her, and that she didn't know how to make the feeling stop. He'd never understood the message until now. Read next to what I knew. It read less like heartbreak and more like a confession. The final piece came from a place I didn't expect. Ryan's father, Walter, had never been close to me, but he'd also never been unkind. Mostly a quiet man who let his wife run the family's social architecture without much comment. One Sunday, while Ryan was in the garage and Patricia was in the kitchen, Walter told me almost offhandedly that Patricia had once said to him, years ago, that Ryan and I wouldn't last, and that she intended to make sure the right person was already in place when we didn't. He said it like an old joke he'd never fully understood the weight of. I don't think he knew what he'd just handed me. I thanked him for the coffee and drove straight to Danielle's office. By the time I had everything organized, in a folder Danielle helped me structure the way she structured evidence for her firm's cases, I had transfer records, message screenshots, a timeline of family events cross-referenced against the growing closeness between Ryan and Jenna, and Walter's own words, which I asked him gently if he'd be willing to repeat in front of the family if it came to that. He looked uncomfortable, but he said yes. I still hadn't said a word to Ryan. Part of me wanted to give him the chance to tell me himself, to see if there was a version of him underneath all this that would choose honesty before I forced his hand. He never did. If anything, he grew more affectionate that month, more attentive, bringing home flowers twice, planning a weekend trip he called Just Us. And I understood that this wasn't guilt driving him toward me. It was Patricia, coaching him, the same way she'd coached him his whole life, telling him to keep the peace, to keep the appearance intact, right up until the moment it no longer needed to be intact at all. The moment I chose was Patricia's 60th birthday dinner, hosted at her house with the whole family present. The same dining room where she had once given that toast about standards. The same table where Jenna had been seated across from Ryan more times than I could count. I arrived early, before most of the guests, and asked Patricia if I could help set the table, something I'd never volunteered for before. She looked faintly surprised, almost pleased, as if this small gesture confirmed something she'd always suspected I lacked. I smiled and told her I wanted tonight to be memorable. Ryan's aunts and uncles arrived first, then his cousins, then last, Jenna, who hesitated in the doorway when she saw me already seated near the head of the table, close enough to Patricia that anyone watching would assume I hadn't noticed a thing. Jenna's smile was thin. I smiled back, warm and easy, and watched her shoulders drop half an inch with relief. Dinner moved through its ordinary rhythm, the clinking of glasses, Walter's quiet jokes, Patricia holding court about her garden and her book club, and I let it run its course, because timing mattered more than anger. I waited until dessert was served, until the whole table was settled and unguarded, before I stood, tapped my glass, and asked if I could say a few words for Patricia's birthday. She beamed. She had no idea what was coming, and for a moment, watching her face, I almost felt something close to pity. Almost. I thanked her for 6 years of being part of the family, for the holidays, for the standards she'd always held everyone to. Then I said that in the spirit of those standards, of honesty and family loyalty she valued so highly, I wanted to share something I'd learned recently, because I thought everyone at the table deserved the same honesty Patricia had always claimed to want from me. I opened the folder. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I read the transfer dates in the same flat, clear voice Danielle had taught me to use when presenting evidence. $9,200 moved out of my business over 14 months, always by the same login, always to the same account. I read Jenna's own message about Patricia telling her she deserved a family that truly valued her. I asked Walter directly, in front of everyone, to repeat what he'd told me about Patricia's plan to have the right person ready. His face went pale, but he did it quietly, staring at the tablecloth instead of his wife. Jenna's fork clattered against her plate. Ryan sat frozen, staring at me like he was trying to remember which version of the last month had actually been real. Patricia's composure cracked in pieces. First confusion, then a brittle attempt at laughter, calling it a misunderstanding, and finally, when the numbers and dates refused to move or soften under her voice, something closer to fury, aimed not at herself, but at me for daring to say any of it out loud. At her table, in front of her guests. "This is not the place," she said. Her voice sharpened into something I'd never heard her use before. "Not at me, not at anyone. Whatever you think you understand, Mara, you're choosing to humiliate this family in my own home." I told her I understood perfectly well, that I had spent 6 years listening to her talk about standards and loyalty and what a family owed to itself, and that tonight I was simply holding her to the same measure she had always held me to. I asked her directly whether she had ever once encouraged Jenna to see herself as a better fit for her son's life. Patricia's jaw tightened, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, which told the table everything her voice refused to. Ryan's cousin Emily, seated near the far end of the table, spoke up then, quiet at first, saying she'd always found it strange how often Jenna was included in things that should have been ours alone, our anniversary dinners, our vacation planning calls, moments Patricia had somehow folded her into without anyone quite noticing when the folding happened. Once one person said it out loud, 2 more nodded. I hadn't planned for that moment, hadn't scripted anyone else's honesty into the evening, but it landed harder than anything I could have said myself, because it wasn't coming from the wounded wife. It was coming from people who had simply been watching for years and never had a reason to say so until now. I told her that I had learned something from her, actually. I'd learned that if you wait long enough and gather enough proof, you don't need to raise your voice to bring an entire structure down. You only need to place it where everyone can finally see the cracks that were always there. Ryan didn't defend his mother. He didn't defend Jenna either. He sat very still, and when he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, asking me how long I'd known. I told him 3 weeks. He asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. I told him I wanted to know the whole shape of what I was dealing with before I said a single word. The same discipline that had built my business applied finally to my own marriage. The dinner ended in fragments. Aunts and uncles quietly gathering coats. Nobody quite meeting anyone else's eyes. Patricia's birthday cake left half-eaten on the counter. Jenna left first, alone, her face wrecked in a way I recognized, because it was the same wreckage I'd been carrying for 3 weeks, and finally allowed myself to set down. The following days moved fast, once the truth was loose in the world. I filed a formal report with Danielle's help regarding the unauthorized transfers, not out of cruelty, but because letting it go would have meant pretending it never happened, and I was finished pretending. Jenna repaid the money in full within 2 weeks, through her own lawyer, without a single conversation between us, because there was nothing left to say that either of us hadn't already understood. Ryan moved out 10 days after the dinner. We didn't scream at each other during that conversation. I simply told him that I could maybe have forgiven an affair born out of confusion, 2 people caught in a moment of weakness. What I couldn't forgive was learning that his own mother had spent years quietly building the path toward that moment, and that some part of him had walked it without ever once looking back to check if I was still standing where he'd left me. He didn't argue. I think, somewhere underneath the shame, he already knew I was right. Patricia's standing in the family didn't survive that dinner either. Walter, of all people, was the one who finally drew a line, telling her plainly, in front of their own kitchen a week later, that he was done watching her treat people's lives like pieces on a board she alone controlled. He didn't leave her, and I don't think he ever seriously considered it. But something in their marriage shifted after that. A quiet redistribution of who got to speak for the family and who simply had to live with what was said. Ryan's cousins, who had always been polite to me but distant, started reaching out afterward, one of them admitting she'd noticed the same patterns for years and never known how to say so. Another sending a message that simply read, "I'm sorry we all let her get away with it for so long." Patricia found herself, for the first time in a very long time, without an audience for her version of events, and I watched, from a careful distance, as she tried and failed to rebuild one. Jenna and I never spoke again after that dinner, not properly. She sent one message, weeks later, that I read twice and never answered. It said she was sorry that she'd let herself believe things about her place in my life that were never true, that she understood if I hated her but hoped someday I wouldn't. I didn't hate her. What I felt was closer to grief, the specific kind that comes from losing someone you trusted since childhood, to a manipulation she never fully recognized as manipulation, right up until it had already cost her everything worth keeping. I heard through a mutual acquaintance months later that she'd moved 2 towns over, started fresh at a different salon, and rarely mentioned the Whitfield family at all anymore. I hoped, in the quiet parts of myself that still remembered the girl who taught me to French braid, that she'd found something steadier than what Patricia had offered her. Ryan tried, once, about 2 months after he moved out, to ask whether there was any version of us that could still exist. We met at a neutral coffee shop, careful and formal in a way that still felt strange after 6 years of easy familiarity. I told him the truth, that I didn't think I hated him, that I even understood, in some clinical, distant way, how a person raised by someone like Patricia might grow up without a strong enough instinct to question her, to draw his own lines instead of walking the ones she'd already drawn for him. But understanding wasn't the same as trusting, and I told him plainly that I didn't know how to build a marriage with someone who needed a public reckoning before he was willing to see what had been happening in his own house. He didn't argue. He asked if we could at least stay civil for the sake of the years we'd shared. I told him we could, and we have, mostly, in the careful, distant way that people manage when too much has been said to go back to anything simpler. Ethan and I stayed in touch through all of it, first out of shared purpose, then out of something quieter and steadier. He never pushed. In the weeks right after Ryan moved out, he mostly just checked in, a text asking how the salon was doing, an offer to help me carry boxes when I finally repainted the office that had once belonged to both me and Jenna. He never once brought up what almost happened between us, as though it were owed to him because of what we'd uncovered together. And I think that restraint told me more about him than anything he could have said outright. He simply kept showing up, the way you show up for someone who has finally started trusting her own instincts again. And I found myself looking forward to those conversations more than I expected to, texting him about small, ordinary things, a difficult client, a new shipment of shampoo, nothing that had anything to do with Patricia or Ryan or Jenna at all, which was, in its own way, exactly what I needed. We didn't rush anything. There was a version of this story where I could have fallen straight from one relationship into another, using him to fill the space Ryan left behind. And both of us seemed to understand, without ever discussing it directly, that doing so would have cheapened whatever this actually was. So we took our time. Dinner, eventually. A weekend trip to the coast, eventually. Nothing announced to the family, nothing performed for anyone else's benefit. Just two people who had both been quietly underestimated by someone they trusted, slowly learning what it felt like to be chosen honestly instead of maneuvered into place. 6 months later, I sat in my salon on a slow Tuesday afternoon, the same lavender-scented air, the same leash hooks I drilled in myself, except the office behind me now had my name alone on every account, every login, every signature line. I had hired a new front desk assistant, a college student named Priya, who was reliable and asked for nothing but a fair paycheck, and the business had grown steadier than it had been in over a year, freed from money quietly bleeding out the back door. I think about that night outside the glass sometimes, watching Ryan's hand on Jenna's face, and I no longer feel the same cold drop in my stomach. I feel something closer to clarity. Patricia spent years trying to convince me I wasn't enough for her son's life. What she actually did was teach me, finally, exactly how much I was worth once I stopped waiting for anyone else to notice. I didn't win by destroying anyone. I won by refusing to disappear quietly, by insisting that the truth be seen by the very people who had spent years pretending not to see it. Some evenings, closing up the salon alone, keys in hand, I catch my own reflection in the darkened glass of the front door, and for the first time in a long while, I recognize exactly who is looking back at me.
Thank you so much for watching. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.